Welcome to the fourth lesson on war and storytelling in Ukraine. And before we get into intelligence, which are the next three principles of the 9 principles of war and how it relates to storytelling, I quickly just want to review where we were in the last 3 lessons. First of all, we learned that storytelling is the most powerful weapon in war, and that storytelling itself gives you the ability to win the narrative war. And right now, after talking about the inherent advantages Ukraine had, combined with a great storyteller as a president, despite any other things that President Zelensky and his administration may have done wrong leading up to the war, and I think there will be a lot of historical debate about how ready Ukraine was, how seriously they took the threat of invasion, how well civil society and the population was. The inherent advantage that Ukraine has right now on the storytelling front is critical. In fact, until that changes and turns around, I believe it's just a matter of time and cost before Ukraine's going to win the war. But that could change if Russia manages to get its narrative working, if they manage to mobilize the population, if Ukraine's population loses faith in their narrative that victory is attainable, that could change. But right now, based on what we talked about before, the last lesson, Ukraine's winning the principles of storytelling. And that is the story itself. It's a clear message. It's something that's rallying the people. And based off of that clear message, compared to the one in Russia, which really isn't rallying people in civil society in Russia to fight for the cause as much, that is the key advantage. And then you have marketing, which is distribution, and then you have sales, which is really that in-person selling of the story at all levels, whether it's as a leader in your formation, to your own soldiers, to the local population that you're trying to win over, the Russian side and the Ukrainian side, and then finally to the global audience that you're trying to influence, diplomats, citizens across the world who can support Ukraine. So the next 3 principles that we're going to talk about is called on intelligence. The first 3 were on information, which includes storytelling, sales, and marketing. And the next 3 principles we're going to talk about today are on intelligence. And intelligence is really important because all that stuff you see on television, all the stuff that's exciting, like offensives, raids, all the things that end up taking the final decisive action on the battlefield, you can't win a war without holding and taking ground. You can't win a war without closing with destroying the enemy. Until infantry soldiers are on the ground controlling something, you haven't won the war. So those last 3 principles, which we're going to talk about next, are really important, but you cannot succeed in offensive operations. You cannot target the right thing with raids. You cannot defend properly if you don't know the enemy's coming without intelligence. So we're going to talk about those 3 principles of intelligence today and how critical that is for an army, a nation, to succeed in wartime. So there's 3 main principles of intelligence I'm going to talk about today. 3 main forms of intelligence, and they're going to be in order of importance. And the photo up here that you see is from the opening stages of Operation Barbarossa in 1941. Now, if you remember, we talked about this. Germany and the Soviet Union in 1939 made a secret pact right before the invasion of Poland, which shocked the world and effectively ended up carving up Eastern Europe, and specifically Poland, in the initial campaign of World War II. And Stalin and Hitler formed this unholy alliance of 2 dictators that a lot of people assumed in the 1930s were going to go to war together. They were actually on opposite sides during the Spanish Civil War. They were really ideologically opposed. Communists and Nazis in Germany were literally fighting each other in the streets. So it shocked the world that they got together. But Stalin and Hitler, both being ultimate pragmatists in a way, at least at that point, decided to have a marriage of convenience and carve up spheres of influence. But the thing that Stalin didn't understand or didn't want to hear in 1941 leading up to the invasion of the Soviet Union was his own intelligence. There were a lot of Soviet intelligence agents who'd infiltrated throughout Europe. They had spies all over Europe, inside of Poland, inside of Germany, inside of France. The Soviet Union's NKVD had the best spy network in Europe. And they were giving reports back to Stalin that something was coming. And also, how do you get 3 million soldiers from the German army onto the border without being noticed? Well, they were noticed. This information was passed up to Stalin before the invasion happened. And again, there was a lot of intelligence that was filtering up to Joseph Stalin's desk. But just like we talked about before the war, on both sides, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in this lesson, the Soviet Union did not make any moves to prepare for the pending German invasion. They did not make any moves. And we're going to talk about this in a little moment here, about the intelligence assumptions and failures on both sides, Ukraine and Russia under Vladimir Putin, in terms of what they wanted to hear and what they wanted to believe before the war started. So the three parts of intelligence are as follows. First is human intelligence. And human intelligence is your spies. It's your spy network across the world that's spying on the enemy inside their state if you can, up to the highest levels. It's your spy network on the battlefield. It goes all the way up to strategic, but all the way down to the lowest level on the battlefield. And we're going to talk about the different levels of war, strategic, operational, and tactical, when we go through each one of these principles. The second principle that we're going to talk about is surveillance. And there's different types of surveillance. There can be electronic surveillance, satellite surveillance, signals intercepts, radio intercepts, human surveillance. We're going to talk about all these different types of surveillance, but surveillance is collection. And the reason why I put human intelligence before surveillance is there's an infinite number of things that you can collect on out there. You can have literally data overload by having satellite imagery all over the earth. But until humans tell you what the motivations are behind the intelligence that you need to collect on, you don't know where to focus your efforts. If you know the motivations of someone through a spy network, through human intelligence, you can then bring all of your surveillance assets to bear to see if what that human intelligence report is saying is true or not. So it allows you to focus your efforts, because what happens in the intelligence world is data overload. Mountains of data come in, and this is why the United States did not catch the September 11th attacks before they happened, is all the information was out there if they would have known where to look, but the United States didn't have human intelligence insights into the thinking and to the plans of Al-Qaeda before the attacks happened. So all that surveillance didn't make a difference. And then the last thing is reconnaissance. Now, reconnaissance is different from surveillance, because reconnaissance is when you put yourself out there and you're ready to fight for information. Okay, reconnaissance is where you go into enemy territory or on the battlefield, and you literally are going out there and looking for and actively seeking out information. It's the difference between surveillance and reconnaissance. A lot of times it's just a matter of moving out there and being able to fight for information. Whether you're a plane flying over a certain area, a UAV, you're out there looking for information. You're putting that platform at risk of being shut down, whether it's manned or unmanned. That reconnaissance asset can usually be shut down. Now, there's a little bit of a bleed over between what is surveillance and reconnaissance, but fundamentally reconnaissance is you being willing to go out there and, if needs be, put yourself at risk, fight for information. It's generally moving, versus surveillance is more passive standoff type of. Now, people who are doing surveillance can get shot also, right? It's not sometimes a totally safe thing. Satellites can get shot out of the skies. Cameras on the battlefield can get shot. Soldiers who are doing surveillance can get shot. We'll talk about this and the differences. But fundamentally, the Soviet Union failed in its ability to collect or decide or predict the invasion of their country in 1941 because all the stuff coming in did not fit the leader's understanding or hopes or wishes or desires for what he thought was going to happen. Stalin fundamentally thought that Hitler was not going to invade the Soviet Union. He didn't think it was never going to happen, but he thought that Hitler needed his raw materials, his oil, all the other things that the Soviet Union, the foodstuffs that they were providing, and therefore he refused to believe, did not act on the intelligence, the human intelligence, the surveillance, reconnaissance spies that he had actively on the border going and looking for signs of invasion. He just didn't listen to it. And in this war, we'll talk about in a moment, Russia and Ukraine did the same thing to a certain extent. So let's talk about human intelligence. This is a picture of Adolf Hitler at the Munich conference, and there's a wonderful Netflix movie which dramatizes the Munich Agreement. This is 1938. This is right before the potential outbreak of hostilities between the Czech Republic, or Czechoslovakia at the time, and Germany, because Czechoslovakia thought it had security guarantees from France and Great Britain and was prepared to not give in to Hitler's demands, a lot like Vladimir Putin right before the outbreak of the full-scale invasion of this year. There were unreasonable demands which the Allied powers, the guarantors of the international system, France and Great Britain, could have said to Hitler, hey, we're not going to allow you to take these key territories from Czechoslovakia. And what Hitler was asking for at that moment was the secure mountain fortification areas militarily of the Czechoslovakian state. Czechoslovakia is mainly flat land except for this area called the Sudetenland, which just happened to have a lot of native German speakers from the old Austrian Empire, German ethnic Germans as part of its territory. And Hitler was basically saying, hey, we need to bring all Germans into the Third Reich, the empire. They cannot be living outside of our borders. It's intolerable, a lot like Putin was demanding to protect Russian speakers inside of Ukraine. And the parallels between the two situations, 1938 and 2022 of this year, are very similar. History is never exactly the same, but it certainly rhymes, and in this case it did. And here's the fundamental thing that failed at Munich, and the Netflix series, The Edge of War, this movie dramatizes it, is the Allied powers did not have inside human intelligence into the internal chaos and turmoil that Hitler's threat against Czechoslovakia was having inside the German army, German high command, German military. And the German military, the German army, thought, and they told this story after the war at the Nuremberg trials, they thought it was crazy for Hitler to start a war with the Czechoslovakia because Czechoslovakia had great entrenched positions in highly defensible terrain in the mountains, great tanks, great armored vehicles, great fortifications. And the German army was literally, they thought it was suicidal to go to war with Czechoslovakia, especially if France and Great Britain would have invaded, like they should have done with their security guarantee, on the western side of Germany. They just said, we're going to lose this. And they were prepared, and they were trying to coordinate and get this information to the Allies, but weren't able to. They were prepared to have a coup against Hitler if he would have gone through with his threat to invade Czechoslovakia, because they thought it was suicidal, it was going to destroy their country. And the only thing that failed there was the Allies did not have intelligence connections inside the German high command, which I think is very different than what happened in 22. We're not going to know for a while, but I guarantee the United States, which made a different calculation this time about Ukraine, they understood before the war Putin's intentions, probably had great human intelligence, maybe still do, maybe have even better human intelligence sources inside the Russian government now, which is helping inform how much they support Ukraine, how far they can push the envelope without risking a global conflict between the United States and Russia, or Russia and NATO powers, which they want to avoid, but they want Ukraine to win. And human intelligence is the fundamental thing that you can and should get right if you want to win a war. You want to understand at all levels, inside the highest decision-making centers of your enemy that you're up against, what they're thinking, what they're going to do. And this allows you to focus the rest of your intelligence because you can collect infinite amount of data on all the different types of surveillance, and you can, you only have a certain amount of people you can send out and risk their lives, UAVs, air platforms on reconnaissance. And you need to be able to focus that on the things that your human intelligence is telling you to focus on. So this was also my experience in Iraq as a commander. And one of the things I realized as a company level commander in charge of 140 soldiers was the primacy of intelligence. And as much as you want to go out and do raids and do all kinds of other stuff as a soldier, and my soldiers were doing a lot of that stuff, I was directing their intelligence collection. The fundamental thing that I knew that I needed to do well and I needed to engage myself in was human intelligence collection, talking to the local population, talking to the leaders, talking to people inside our partners in the Iraqi police, the Iraqi army, tribal leaders, the mayor, all these different people, and really understanding the people that we were trying to win over, the local population. The reason I bring this up is in this war in Ukraine, there are Ukrainian areas that are under Russian occupation, right? And how well those leaders are engaging in this practice of collecting human intelligence, getting sources inside the community to try and find Ukrainians who are doing partisan activity against them, is really a huge part of this war that we don't see, we're not going to hear about and learn about until these territories are liberated, right? And this is what we were doing in Iraq, ironically, on the other side, the side a lot like the Russians. We had to secure the population, and the core of securing the population was, first of all, getting the story right, like I talked about in the last lesson, the letter that we wrote to the local population. But when we wrote that letter, when we got the story out there, when we started winning that information war, mountains of human intelligence came into me. And as a commander, I spent tons of time. In fact, we'll talk about this more in the next lesson when we talk about raids and operations. All of our high-value successes in operations, which turned into fights in terms of raids and defensive operations, came from human intelligence. People who, because they believed that we were the better people to support from a security perspective for their future, came in and gave me a lot of human intelligence. And we got high-level intelligence on high-value targets that we were after because we had great sources. And these great sources came from the information war, which we were winning. And the big question in Ukraine is, can the Russian occupying forces win the information war? Can they get great human intelligence to pacify the areas that they're trying to control so that they can free up forces to send to the front to defend whatever the front lines are against Ukrainian forces? Or are they going to be consumed by human intelligence failures or not having enough human intelligence so that they can't find the partisans inside of Ukraine that are fighting them behind enemy lines or in their area? And that's going to be the big fight. And I've been on the other side of the table, and I understand how time-consuming and how important this is. So human intelligence is critical at every level, all the way from strategic, but even down to the tactical level. If you're controlling a small city, a village, are the people giving you information, or are they hiding information from you and passing information to the local partisans? And this is something that the Ukrainian forces, I know from speaking to them, are actively trying to facilitate, is this resistance, this partisan movement to tie down, bleed out Russian forces behind the lines. And this is something that the Russians obviously are going to want to fight against. So strategic human intelligence, this is the head of the Ukrainian Intelligence Directorate, Major General Kirill Budanov. And the more I learn about the war as someone who's volunteering and talking to a lot of people in the military, the more his name comes up. And he has become a huge power center in the war, in the media. He's been put out there a lot in terms of giving information to the foreign media. And one of the things that I'm really discovering is, for good or for bad, he's a huge power player in this war, right? And Budanov's background is he actually fought in the GUR line units, has done a lot of classified operations behind enemy lines, only 36 years old, but since the war started in the Donbass, he's been actively out there fighting for, doing reconnaissance, special operations to collect information. So he knows from the ground level, by putting himself out there, being wounded in these operations, he knows every level of intelligence all the way up. And one of the things that's been really interesting about Budanov is he has accurately predicted the war, especially before the war started, when the SBU chief, which was Zelensky's childhood friend, was basically saying, hey, this isn't going to happen. The GUR, in fact, right before the war, really freaked out the Ukrainian elites when he spoke about what he thought was going to happen, but it was a dissenting opinion compared to what the SBU was saying and what President Zelensky was inclined to want to believe about whether the war was going to start. They had sources inside of Belarus, they had sources inside of the Russian military, and when he talks, and if you listen to him in interviews, you can tell that he has very good human intelligence sources deep inside the Russian state, deep inside Belarus, and obviously, of course, inside Ukraine. And because he was ready for this war to start, which you'd hope your military intelligence would be looking at the worst case scenario and being ready for these things, Ukraine has a huge, I believe, strategic human intelligence advantage in terms of understanding what the Russians are going to do at the highest levels down all the way to the operational and tactical levels. But Russia also is playing very high level at the strategic intelligence game. The difference between that is the Ukrainian strategic military intelligence got this right, although they weren't listened to, or a lot of people would say they weren't listened to by their political leadership. At least they had the worst case scenario in mind, and they were ready for this war to start in the military. Zaluzny, General Syrskyi, they weren't really listening to the political leadership in terms of their internal preparations for a war that they were being told by their head of intelligence was going to start. However, civil society wasn't quite ready for the war to start. There was no draft, there was no conscription, there was no martial law until the war actually was launched. But at least the strategic leadership was ready, and that's because Ukraine has had, I believe, a huge advantage in their human intelligence sources, which correctly predicted the start of the war. And on the Russian side, they had great strategic human intelligence inside of the Ukrainian state. They had, and they still do. Look at the disruption to the Ukrainian power grid. Someone knows exactly how the power grid is working, and they're passing that information back to the Russians, and they're targeting Ukraine very, very effectively. However, what happened in the Russian human intelligence collection process was this consumer bias, as they call it. People knew what President Putin wanted to hear. This is Bortnikov, the head of the FSB, the Russian intelligence service. And he was in charge of cultivating sources inside of Ukraine because Russia, even though the FSB is the Russian internal security service, Russia philosophically believes Ukraine is a wayward province of Russia, which is eventually going to come back. So FSB was the main unit in charge of human intelligence on Ukraine before the war. And this is what formed the foundation for the plan, the assumptions around the war in Ukraine for Russia. And the FSB believed, through all the money that it had given out to lots of people in Ukraine, that they had the human intelligence operatives inside of Ukraine to basically effect a almost bloodless coup. Because if you look at, and this is why a lot of people inside Ukraine, the Ukrainian SBU, did not believe the war was going to start. And a lot of defense analysts, Andrei Zagorohodnyuk, who was at our Kyiv roundtable, they believed that the war was not going to start because Russia just didn't have enough forces. 190,000 soldiers was just not enough forces to win in Ukraine. Remember, we talked about the story and the assumptions last time. And the problem with that is that their assumptions were off. And the FSB, their human intelligence, which was supposed to form the entire plan, do I need 190,000 soldiers or 500,000 soldiers? Does Russia need to mobilize before the war to effectively invade and occupy Ukraine? Or can they get away with not doing that? And all of that came down to human intelligence, which gave the assumptions for the entire operation. All of the operational assumptions were based on human intelligence in Russia. Okay? And so see how intelligence failures, human intelligence assumptions, can drive bad operations. So strategic intelligence is most important, strategic human intelligence, especially before a war is going to start, but it keeps going during the war. Has Russia learned from their strategic human intelligence failures before the war to make better assumptions about the war now? Is Ukraine overestimating their own human intelligence sources inside the Kremlin, inside of Russia? We won't quite know that, but it's going to be constantly an evolving battle, right? And that's really at the state level, at the highest level in terms of strategy, resources, plans, perceptions around peace and negotiation, all those things. Now, at the operational level in human intelligence, this is a picture from Kherson. And Kherson was the first region that Ukraine set out to liberate in its own country, the first major region. And even though Izium and the Kharkiv region was liberated first, so after strategic intelligence, the next level down is operational intelligence. And this is a picture from Kherson with the protesters right after Russia conquered Kherson in the early part of the war, who got pushed underground with Russian forces basically suppressing these protests and saying, hey, we can't allow you to do this. And what happened in Kherson was the first major resistance movement behind enemy lines sprung up. And I know this because I know some of the people who work in this movement, and it became this huge source of information in terms of targeting and data that goes back to the Ukrainian High Command, which allows Ukrainians to say, hey, let's put our satellites over this area because some human has already told us this is where there's a weapons cache. This is where Russian command posts are. This is where Russian helicopters and air assets are. And instead of just believing someone, which is bad intelligence, you can't take one single source and say, well, because this one person said it, we're going to drop a bomb on this area. But what you can do is you can say, okay, well, in the limited amount of bandwidth that we have with our intelligence specialists, we can focus our collection. We can go ask the United States or Western allies to put a satellite over this area. And we can look at that and we can say, okay, we verified that this is a target that we should hit with our artillery, with our HIMARS, with our attack helicopters, UAVs, or whatever, right? So human intelligence at the operational level is critical, and the Kherson resistance is really a great example of a human intelligence network that it's amazing. If you look at the Kherson offensive, everyone was afraid that there would be a huge knockdown, drag-out battle for the city of Kherson, which would have been a disaster, not just for the local population who would have been caught up in the crossfire, but also for the Ukrainian military, because when you're attacking a city, look at what happened to the Russians inside Mariupol. You need a 8 or 9 to 1 manpower advantage, and you're going to take huge casualties taking a large built-up urban area like Kherson. Kherson could have been several thousand, tens of thousands of casualties for the Ukrainians from just a couple thousand well-entrenched Russian fighters who knew what they were doing, could have basically destroyed the city, killed a bunch of the local population, and taken with them a huge amount of Ukrainian soldiers. But the reason why the Russians did not choose to stand and fight and defend Kherson was because the human intelligence network of the Ukrainian resistance forces provided amazing targeting data, which allowed the Ukrainian forces to basically starve the Russian forces out logistically by destroying the bridges across the Dnipro River, but also destroying weapons caches, command posts, and really making it impossible for the Russian forces to continue to occupy the right bank of the river. And this is really important because human intelligence saved a huge amount of lives on the Ukrainian forces' side because they basically made Russian life in occupied Kherson and the right bank of the Dnipro untenable, unsalvageable in terms of operations. And this goes to show the power of human intelligence in the operational level. And then tactical human intelligence. This is a photo of a mass grave site outside of Izium. And Izium, at the beginning of the war, was actually fought over a couple times. It changed hands. It was taken by the Russians early in the war. Ukrainian forces came in and pushed him out. This is actually where Denis Antipov was wounded his first time before he was killed, was fighting inside in the area of Izium at the beginning of the war. Then, of course, the Russians came in and captured Izium and the surrounding areas, and then they held it until September, when the Kharkiv counteroffensive liberated this area. And one of the things that you see here is the cost of human intelligence, the cost of being an informant, a spy. A lot of these people they found inside of the graves were tortured. Is whether or not it was true, Russians were torturing people because they believed that they were spies. They believed that they were informants. They believed that the reason why their areas were being targeted with precise ammunition strikes, HIMARS strikes, artillery strikes, was because of locals giving up that information. And while everyone that they tortured and killed definitely probably wasn't a spy, that paranoia, that suspicion, fed that type of activity and that type of brutality. And that's a way to make an example of people by killing them and torturing them to try and dissuade other people from being informants, tactical human intelligence informants. But it can backfire. If you have your friend or someone in your family killed or captured by Russian forces, it can make the opposite effect. And I've seen this cut both ways in terms of our experience in Iraq. When you fight someone and they get killed, that could push their family to get into the resistance against you, right? Whereas maybe before they had no interest in informing or picking up a rifle to fight against you. So human intelligence is very dangerous. Being a spy, being an informant. I was just listening to a podcast where this girl from Sumy region was interviewed after being captured for 6 months by Russian forces who caught her spying on and passing on their positions to the Ukrainian military. And she admitted to it. She said, yes, that's what I was doing. And she was held in detention for 6 months inside Russian territory, tortured, you hear all these stories of men being tortured. She was actually tortured the same way because she was caught by the Russian soldiers spying on her. And then they asked her, would you do it? And she said, yeah, I'd do it. I'd do it all over again. Okay, so it takes a huge amount of courage to be an informant, a spy. And of course, there are spies inside Ukraine who are giving information to the Russian forces. And you know that's not going to be a very pleasant situation for them when they're caught by Ukrainian authorities, which the SBU is constantly looking for these counterintelligence operations. Russians who are running around Kyiv and giving information on the airstrikes to Russian forces. So it cuts both ways. Okay, so that's human intelligence at all three levels. Now let's talk about surveillance. And in World War II, there was this program. This is actually a picture of the Enigma machine. And the Enigma machine was the German cryptography machine, kind of like, cryptocurrency now. It was supposedly unhackable. But in 1939, when Poland was conquered, Polish soldiers who had captured the Enigma machine actually made it out of Poland and brought it back to Great Britain, where they set up a huge signals intelligence operation of mathematicians and code breakers. Originally, Poles had figured this out. They became the heart of a huge classified operation to crack the code that the Germans were using to transmit orders across the world. And they did it. And it wasn't until 1974, 30 years after World War II, that it even became public knowledge that this capability had existed. And this ability of Allied forces at the high level to understand strategic operational movements of the Germans, and sometimes a lot of even tactical information was relayed on Enigma, although mostly at the tactical level, it was traditional forms of communication like radio. It allowed Allied forces to really understand what the Germans were doing when the Germans thought they had no idea that their communications were being hacked. Now, Allies didn't know everything. They were constantly changing their cryptographic settings, and sometimes it would take more time than others for the Allies to get back into the system and understand what was going on. But so sensitive was their ability to read this information that sometimes they would have something and they would purposely not act on it. And in fact, allow soldiers, sailors, airmen, whatever, to get killed in attacks by the Germans because they knew that if at this point we gave this information or we acted on it, it might be too suspicious to the Germans. And they might figure out that somehow we're reading their classified communications. So surveillance, this is something that they were able to pass on to the Soviet forces, sometimes in terms of giving some information, but they never told Stalin they had this ability, but sometimes they could pass on information if they knew it, and it wasn't going to tip off Stalin about how they knew it in terms of German plans. So this is really important, is understanding. So there's different types of surveillance, and the types of surveillance have expanded based on the technological capabilities. So there's satellite images. That's really important today. Commercial satellite imagery is being fed to Ukraine from all kinds of different sources. American intelligence, satellite imagery, it's a huge source of information. But again, you can't possibly sit down and analyze every inch of Ukraine with satellite imagery every day. You don't have enough people to sit there and actually make sense of the imagery you're looking at. So you need to focus that collection, that time that it takes to analyze this satellite imagery. But it's a huge force multiplier in terms of the battlefield. You have signal intercepts. There was actually telegram chats by Ramzan Kadyrov before the war where he was talking about the potential invasion of Ukraine, which have made it into the public sphere. And a lot of people theorize this is one of the data points that the US and Great Britain used, this intercepted voice notes from his phone that were somehow found about what was going to happen. Drone footage. Okay, drone footage from these little tiny quadcopters all the way up to Bayraktars and strategic level drones is huge. And then there's surveillance cameras. On the Donbass for the last 8 years, Ukrainian forces have had literally cameras in the trench lines that have been used to monitor Russian activity. And then you have cell phones. Individuals who are collecting intelligence can take a photo, send it out on Telegram to a national hotline. Ukrainians will analyze this information from this national hotline and then feed it into the intelligence targeting system. And then finally, human observation. At the end of the day, humans are and will always be on the battlefield the primary means of looking. You do not want to sit in a trench and not have someone inside your squad looking outside of the trench line, because cameras can be not working in certain types of weather. They can lose their battery. Drone footage might not always be there for you. Satellite imagery could be way too late for you. The ultimate form of surveillance is actually humans, and it always will be. Now, let's talk about strategic surveillance. Before the war in February, I remember looking constantly at some open source intelligence analysts. Konrad Muzyka actually was the world's top expert on the Belarusian military and Russian military forces. And he was constantly saying, based on satellite imagery, Russia is going to invade Ukraine, when Ukraine was saying, no, it's not going to happen. And how was he able to predict the war? He was just looking at satellite imagery. And he was using satellite imagery to determine the status of Russian forces. And this intelligence was available to Ukrainian forces too. They had to have been seeing it themselves. But open source intelligence analysts who called this war before it happened, a lot of them were just using satellite imagery, right? At the strategic level, it was able to inform what Russian intentions were, combine that with human intelligence sources that the US and allied forces probably had. It was one of the main drivers of big force movement observations that led to the prediction of the war. And this wasn't available back in World War II. You were able to get much more strategic surprise like the Germans did because satellite imagery has really revolutionized strategic surveillance. It's really hard to move a lot of forces. It's impossible to move a lot of forces without being seen because of satellite imagery. And that's really revolutionized the field of strategic surveillance. Now, operational surveillance is, again, done in different ways. In Kherson and a lot of these other regions, it could have been as simple as cell phone footage that's sent back on some kind of encrypted chat. But when you get human intelligence, what do you do before you waste precious HIMARS ammunition or subject a drone to being shot down or an Air Force pilot? You want to check it. So you might have multiple forms of surveillance to go out there to make sure before you serve a target or risk something to hit a target, whether it's just valuable HIMARS ammunition or something else, or a special forces team to go in there and take something out or capture someone. You really want to have great surveillance to make sure that what you're doing is verified. With 2, 3, sometimes 4 sources is the best practice. And that's what good intelligence forces do, is they have multiple forms of surveillance before you go out there and you risk something to hit a target. And then, of course, tactical surveillance. I talked about this before. At the tactical level, you usually don't have enough resources to get the humans out of the surveillance game. And one of the cardinal rules of security is always to have someone awake, a couple people awake in case someone falls asleep, especially at night. Because if you do not have a certain part of the line covered, because your surveillance plan is off and people aren't always awake, multiple people are awake, you can literally have soldiers get overrun and killed in their sleep. And this is the surveillance at the tactical level. Snipers with scopes, riflemen with scopes on top of their rifles is much better than just the naked eye, but most people don't have those. And you need people, humans, who are willing to listen, see, and monitor things that are happening, right? Listen to the radio, hear if anything's happening, listen outside, see if sounds are suspicious, indicative of enemy activity. Now, finally, reconnaissance. And this picture up here is a picture of inflatable tanks on the south coast of England in 1944. And why is this a picture that shows reconnaissance? One of the things you need to understand in the intelligence world is Ukrainians are especially good at this. Sometimes you get to hear over an unsecured radio channel what you want to hear or what your enemy wants you to hear. A lot of times, Ukrainians have been using deceptive, unencrypted communications to try and throw the Russians off. Like, let's say they bomb a target and Ukrainians say, yes, our air defense site was taken out. And Russians were able to hear that. So based on that, this is actually one of the stories that's coming out about how Ukrainian air defense forces were able to survive the first few days of the war, is Russians bombed certain sites that had decoys there. Okay, they bombed HIMARS that were wooden HIMARS. And then Ukrainians put out communications saying, destroyed a HIMARS, or they've destroyed one of our air defense sites. And Russians get excited because they want to hear that. They want to be able to report all the way up to Tsar Putin, hey, we've destroyed a HIMARS, or we've destroyed an SA-300 site. So you have this telling people what they want to hear so that they can feel good about just risking their lives to drop a bomb or do whatever, sometimes you can create really false intelligence. And you can deceive the enemy into doing things or not doing things that you want to do. And this is classic part of the intelligence game. One of the reasons why the SBU, I believe, didn't believe the invasion was going to happen was because Putin probably knew a lot of the spies from the SBU that were inside of his own regime, and he gave them the information that they wanted to hear, which was, this invasion's not going to happen. Right? So this is part of the intelligence game. And the greatest example at a strategic level of reconnaissance being used to deceive the enemy was actually Germany before the invasion of Normandy in 1944. They did not have air superiority. They could not get their pilots over the English Channel without being shot down, except when the British let them. And the British were allowing German reconnaissance flights constantly to get through across the Pas de Calais, which is where the Germans believed that that's where the invasion was going to happen. It's the shortest point between France and England. You can almost see on clear days the white cliffs of Dover in England from France. And the Germans believed that that was where the invasion was going to happen. It made the most sense. And the Allies knew that that's what the Germans thought, so they made them believe it by literally creating inflatable tank armies. So imagine that satellite imagery from Belarus that allowed us to see the war was coming. The Germans were able to see similar types of formations from high-level reconnaissance flights, but they didn't know, because that was their only source of information, that this was all fake. The Allies even set up entire radio communication units with General Patton, their best general, to run this fictional Allied army to prevent the Germans from understanding that the real attack, the main attack, the only attack across the Channel was going to be in Normandy. In fact, after the Allied landings, they kept running this deception, and the German 15th Army in northeastern France didn't move and reinforce and try and throw the Allied armies back into the sea, because they were always waiting for the invasion they thought was going to happen. So part of intelligence is understanding what your enemy wants to believe, and a lot of times giving them the intelligence indicators to continue believing what they want to believe versus what they should believe, which is what's actually going to happen. So again, in Iraq, one of the things that drove most of our operations, that allowed us to keep ourselves secure behind enemy, inside the population in Iraq, was constant patrols. We would have to constantly guard our lines of communication to get supplies, and if we weren't every day patrolling the routes that we use to resupply our units, we would get attacked. And even if we did go down those routes every day, it wasn't enough. You had to constantly run reconnaissance patrols off of the routes, on the routes, to understand what was going to happen. And reconnaissance also was a way you could pick up information. You could find human intelligence sources. So a lot of times I'd send my soldiers out just to learn about a certain area, see if there was any suspicious activity. But one of their main tasks on that reconnaissance patrol was to make contact with and develop human intelligence sources. So reconnaissance doesn't always have to be you going out on a patrol and shooting someone. In fact, good reconnaissance, you don't get in a fight, right? In reconnaissance, you're not trying to get into a fight, but you're willing to fight, right? You're going out to find a high-value target. If you're looking for something that you've been tasked with looking at, you have weapons, you have enough people to fight if you get into a fight, but that's not your main goal, right? Reconnaissance is, it's a very specialized function inside of the United States Army. I was a reconnaissance officer, and our unit was designed to collect intelligence for a corps level unit. We were operational reconnaissance level unit, and that was our job. But it's always important. It doesn't matter if that's your main job, you always need to be doing reconnaissance. If you have a trench line and you're not patrolling that area right in front of you consistently, the enemy's eventually going to find the weak spots and come attack you. So reconnaissance is something that you have to do at every level. And the Russians, especially inside of Ukraine, are really struggling with this task. I know it because we've done it before. When you're trying to control a local population, is you constantly have to be able to conduct reconnaissance. And it's a really important thing to understand that drives intelligence. You're not going to find human intelligence sources if you never go out and look for them. You're not going to see places that you need to ask for satellite imagery for if you don't go out and look for these things. So all these things work together. Now, strategic reconnaissance. Before the war, Ukraine actually sent their spies from their national level resources into Belarus and into Russia because they'd been hearing about all these training exercises and they wanted to find out, is this army going to invade? And here's the interesting thing that they found out that made them believe that the invasion was not very likely. The Russian soldiers were selling their ammunition, were selling their weapons, were selling their fuel. They were drunk a lot of the time. I mean, they did not look like a serious army getting ready for a war. So one of the things that lulled Ukraine into a false sense of complacency before the war was their strategic reconnaissance showed them maybe what Russia wanted them to see, which is President Putin didn't even tell his own army until 48 hours before the war was going to start, hey, you're going to go to war. So no wonder they were behaving as if they weren't going to go to war, because he fooled his own army, because he knew that Ukrainian forces were going to be looking for signs that the war was going to start. So he just said, well, I'm not going to tell my own soldiers. Now that had huge consequences for the Russian army, because if you don't tell your soldiers they're going to war, what do? They don't take training exercises seriously. They sell their equipment, they get drunk, they don't have enough ammunition on hand because they don't think they're going to need it. So that strategic deception, where Putin let the Ukrainian military see what they wanted to see, or the Ukrainian intelligence services see what they wanted to see, which is, hey, our president's saying this war's not going to happen and Russia's not acting like it's going to happen, was because Putin was deliberately fooling his own forces because he knew that that's how intelligence works. Now, what did that do for him? Well, a lot of people would argue that the Russian military not being ready for the invasion was way more disastrous for them than the Ukrainian military or the Ukrainian political establishment or civil society not believing the invasion was going to happen. But that's an example of strategic reconnaissance, which had a huge impact before the war. Now, during the war, what is strategic reconnaissance? This is Ukrainian SSO forces probably operating inside Crimea. This is Ukrainian SSO forces on Snake Island. This is Ukrainian forces outside of Ukraine, probably, maybe even inside Russia, directing sabotage acts inside of Russia, inside of Belarus. That's where strategic reconnaissance is happening right now. Of course, you'll never hear that this is happening, because if Ukraine's doing that, which I would assume they are, they're certainly not going to talk about it. They're not going to admit to it. But that's a lot of these explosions and mysterious things that are happening inside Russia are probably not just homegrown resistance to the war. It's probably Ukrainian special forces, Ukrainian SBU, Ukrainian high-level reconnaissance units, very, very well trained, very well equipped, doing these missions. Now, operational reconnaissance, this is actually a picture of GUR soldiers. Now, Budanov, the head of the Ukrainian Military Intelligence Directorate, has his own GUR forces. Actually, he was one of these. This is how he rose up through the ranks to get to where he is. And these forces are tasked with finding operationally significant targets. So the Kerch Bridge, strategically significant target. Snake Island, strategically significant target. Targets inside of Russia, strategically significant targets, probably with the SSO and some other level forces. But GUR, and I've met with some of these guys, sat down with them. What do? They go out to the hottest parts of the front line, where the head of Ukrainian intelligence, who reports to Zaluzny directly, says, hey, this is where we should attack next. And I know this because I have my own intelligence forces who are out there, who've been out there operating in small teams, going ahead of the regular units, going behind the enemy lines, doing drone reconnaissance flights, doing patrols, doing sniper missions. And this is where we should attack. And this is why the Kharkiv offensive was so effective, because Ukrainian GUR forces had managed to find, with their intelligence operatives who were willing to go look, go find Russian trench lines where it's undermanned or abandoned, and they were able to direct the offensive and say, this is where the offensive should go. And they're doing the same thing right now. GUR forces are out there across the front lines, I've spoken to them, and they're looking for weaknesses for the next major offensive. And this is really important to understand, because where you launch an offensive is a strategic decision, and the operational success of that, are they going to break through or not, depends on the quality of your reconnaissance. You can't just rely on surveillance. You can't just rely on satellite imagery to say, yep, this is where we should drive and do our main offensive. Reconnaissance is where real people with guns, who are very, very well trained, usually with night vision, very good at hiding, very good at conducting patrols, they're able to say, yes, this is exactly where you should go, and this is exactly where you should drop a bomb, because I'm standing here watching this, right? I've got the drone footage to prove it. I've walked this ground before, and you can get through it because I already have. That is why offensives are successful, is you have gone out and found, and if necessary, fought for that information. That's why Ukraine's been so successful in their recent operations, is this high-level intelligence forces that are guiding these decisions on where to launch offensives and operations. And then finally, tactical reconnaissance. And the thing that's revolutionized reconnaissance in this war has been the proliferation of commercial drones and the integration of commercial drones into combat operations. And what commercial drones allow you to do is extend the reach of your own reconnaissance. You don't always have to go out on a foot patrol. You can do it with a very small quadcopter. And as long as you can see the battlefield in front of you, the 3, 4, 5 kilometers that you need to have observation of to give you early warning of an enemy attack, you can do reconnaissance or surveillance a lot of times with drones. So surveillance has been revolutionized by drones, but also if you want to go find ahead of you where you should attack, you have to go out on foot, but you can use drones to make your reconnaissance patrol a lot more secure. You can have your own little private air force above you while you're moving forward on foot to extend the safety, the reach of what you're doing. So it's a huge revolutionary, I hesitate to say revolutionary because air power has always been there, since the invention of airplanes, and before that balloons. But the proliferation and the pushing down to the lowest level of air assets that you can control without having to ask the Air Force and, President Zaluzny, or sorry, not President Zaluzny, that's a Freudian slip, General Zaluzny, President Zelensky, going all the way up and asking for helicopters and scarce aircraft that are available. Ukraine's actually been able to, because since 2014, they've had drone forces that have been integrated at the lowest level. They've had a huge advantage in the tactical reconnaissance realm specifically over the Russian forces, right? Because Ukraine has been developing this drone common operation picture technology, things that feed back artillery coordinates to artillery through drones has made a huge impact. And this is one of the things that's driving the fight very, very quickly, is the tactical employment of drones. So that concludes on intelligence and our talk about it. And one of the things I'd like to bring us all back to is the power of the stories that we're talking about here. These are all very abstract concepts about the nature of war, but a lot of people have have sacrificed everything to get us to this point. The reason I'm giving this presentation in the center of Kyiv, in the middle of a very dangerous time in terms of Russian strategic strikes, is because of the sacrifices that soldiers have made on the front lines. And this is a recent interview we did at the Borderlands Foundation with Yuri, a friend of mine who I've known since I moved to Kyiv in 2018. And Yuri hired a lot of veterans. He hires a lot of veterans to work inside of his company because he served in the 93rd Brigade in the front lines in 2014 and 15 during the main fighting for the Donetsk airport. And he came back and he started hiring a lot of veterans. And these veterans have become part of his company and his family. And unfortunately for Yuri, he's lost 4 people that used to work for him or have worked with him. So we interviewed Yuri at the Borderlands Foundation. We've created stories around the people, their families that they left behind. My friend Denis Antipov and some other people, Sergey, Ilya, and Dennis, who've worked for him. And we're putting those stories out onto the Borderlands Foundation website. And we're going to have videos and some articles to really memorialize their life. And I just wanted to bring that up. If you're watching these videos and enjoying the content, that there's real human cost that have come to create these lessons, this story, this history, amazing history that's being written by Ukrainians in this war. So please look for those videos and watch them and choose someone that you're inspired by their story and donate. Donate to the foundation if you enjoy the work that we're doing in terms of finding people and putting out those stories, or allowing us to create more videos like this where we talk about the lessons that have been learned in the war, because this is going to help all of us in terms of what Ukraine's been able to do, the lessons we can learn from this, and hopefully save lives in the future by winning this war quicker for Ukraine, and preventing future wars by being experts at these 9 principles of war. So please watch Yuri's story about him and his company and the 4 heroes that he talks about. We'll have a video for each one of them. All right, so the last lesson, which is coming up, lesson 5, we're going to talk about operations. This is where the war movies come in. You see great offensive operations, defensive, heroic defensive stands, daring raids, things like that. But remember, those things would not be possible. They would not be successful unless you were attacking in the right place. The Izium offensive was not successful because Ukraine just has this massive advantage in terms of soldiers or firepower. They still don't. They're still catching up to Russia, but they've been able to start winning the war because they've been winning the intelligence war. And that's really the most important thing after you win the story. And the story leads to access to great intelligence. No one's going to tell you anything if they don't believe in the story you're selling. If they don't believe in the vision, what you're fighting for will not motivate people to get out, risk their lives to get you that intelligence. So we'll go over the end, the most important part, but also the thing that flows from the story and the information, operations, in the 5th and final lecture here. Thank you.